Just for stream purposes, this picking up everything? Is audio all right? Perfect. Thanks. Is the panel ready? Great. The media landscape is risky and cutthroat. We think that when you've gone into this industry, one which is often putting you at a substantial degree of economic harm and even a risk to your safety, we think that you're willing to take on this risk of going up against the government in order to forward better journalism and to get more profit. One frame to begin this speech, which is to say that state media is often controlled and present within these sorts of hybrid regimes for two broad reasons. The first is there's a state incentive, which is to say you want to control discourse surrounding your own actions such that you have less criticism of the things that you do bad within your state, so you want to have media companies which are favorable towards you and which influence that control of information down to people. In terms of your state capacity, we'd say the state has a large amount of money because you have a large economy which you can pull from different parts of your economy, often because of the massive control you have and not having a vote which is able to force you regularly to improve quality of things like social welfare and stuff for people. Then you can slash that money from people within your state in order to fund this. We think secondarily there's a lack of transparency often within these states because states won't regulate themselves and they won't look into their own shady dealings, and as a result there's a lot of backroom corruption which could allow you to buy out these media entities. We'd also note thirdly, just empirically, this is true, Hungary, Turkey, etc. have state-owned media. Why is this important? We think in terms of incentives for this media company, there are a few that are worth noting. The first is profitability, obviously. For an independent media company, people need money in order to live, in order to make better journalism into the future, in order to feed themselves, things like this. But also secondly, journalistic integrity is particularly important to this journalism house. Notice, it is hard to set up an independent media company in the first place because there are large startup costs. For example, you need crew, you need equipment, you need broadcasting licenses and stuff like this. We'd also note that you could have worked in state-owned media and tried to go up through these sorts of companies that already exist, which are probably better backed for the reasons I've already given because of the profit that is able to be pumped into them by the state. Given the fact that you've taken the riskier option, we think you're already opposed to going into a platform which is towards the state, and you have a revealed preference for this. We'd also, secondly, there is a risk to the state of setting up a independent media entity, regardless of whether you're actively oppositional to the state or regardless of whether you are just impartial. Because of this, then, you've already taken on the chance that you might get shut down. You might be have a sort of attack done upon you by people within the state. Given this, we think that safety is not your most proximate incentive, rather being able to put out this sort of journalism is. With that, on that note then, we'd say that attacking the government allows you to be a more profitable, successful, and also generally journalistically good entity. Before I move on to the argument, go.
Yeah, just to be clear on what you defend in this debate. Because impartial, it still means that you criticize the government in cases that everyone agrees you should. What are the specific instances in which you would criticize the government that you think we wouldn't?
We think that what you do is specifically emphasize these failures to a substantial degree, maybe at the cost of some of the successes that the government might have, and perhaps you de-emphasize those successes where they might have occurred, right? I think that's a fairly reasonable characterization. But I'll engage more with the impartiality frame later on, because we did preempt that. On the argument on profitability and success, we would note a number of reasons why this allows you to be successful. The first is on narrative creation. Note, people like conflict. When the Motion song came out, which was fuck you, everybody's jumping around singing. I think people don't like this just on intuition. But the analytical reason is just it's like good drama and gossip, because the conflicts that other people have tend to spill over effects onto others, and as such you want to be informed of them. We think that you create attention by attacking the government specifically. We would note that this is particularly important because a lot of people are just mad at the government all of the time, even if this government is good, because there can still no thank you due to lack of information, degrees of incompetency, and also there's just trade-offs. One man's tax cut is another man's lack of food stamps. Second broad mechanism then is that these governments are often sources of drama inherently and are also often not that great for people within these countries for a couple of reasons. One might be corruption, which is that often because you have control over things like independent opposition, not fully but to a substantial degree where you can maybe intimidate them, you don't you're able to do things like repatriate money towards yourself. We'd also know secondly there's internal conflict whereby by suppressing this opposition there's also a degree of political oppressiveness within this state. And also thirdly, because there is less checks and balances on you, there's more of a capacity to create bad policy. Therefore, it is easy to get people to watch you attack a government which is often bad, which is often one which is not able to perform in the best possible way. We would also note this is particularly sensational for people because the government is the thing that they defer to as the buck that stops with them, as that who controls them, and as such they look up to them when things go bad in their life. The third broad mechanism is differentiation. Given that we've already proven that a lot of the media in the state is quite favorable towards the state, we would say that you're able to differentiate yourself from these larger channels, which are state-backed, by focusing on the bad things that the state does, as opposed to just doing the good things that the state does. I just want to point out a low burden impact here, which is that if a lot of media is very favorable towards the state, you provide better information at this point in which you are showing bad things about the state disproportionately, which allows people to have greater information, which informs things like their voting patterns, informs things like the independent media that they want to consume later down the line, because now, instead of just being flooded by the good things, they're also aware of the bad. But the other benefit of this is that you're just able to make more money, because more people are willing to tune into you, no thank you, if they have a degree of distaste towards this. Opposition, as they've said, other media is being super friendly, then why can't we just be impartial? Why can't we just be middle ground? There's a couple reasons why this is true. The first is to create a stronger narrative and branding, which is to say that you're able to capture this space to a substantially greater degree once you've made yourself the independent oppositional media. The second reason is to attract journalists who are ideological. Given that we've framed that it's easier to go into the state media, if you are not going into the state media, you have a revealed preference towards going to something which is oppositional to the state. Given this, you must take a stronger stance in order to attract these people. The last mechanism for why these media companies are better is international backing. Yeah, go.
Yeah, all of what you've shown is still symmetrical. If everyone else is extremely, pro-government and I'm impartial, that's a significant amount of differentiation people can watch me on.
This is not true for the mechanisms I gave already. Last thing just to say is international backing, which is that often states outside of these hybrid regimes have incentives to try to put out information which is not favorable towards the governments within these states. For instance, the US trying to destabilize Hungary's government, or at least to have some counter narratives towards the government that exists there. The reason for this, because you undermine the power of a strong man within a state, then you're able to make them look far more weak, which allows you to extract more concessions downstream through just not having them have full government support behind them. That's the incentive. But in terms of capacity, we think that international lenders and backers just have substantial amounts of money that they can put in through private equity investment. They can put through just sending over things like journalists, through funding you, through moving into franchising and things like this. As a result, then, we think that you're able to attract money from outside of your country, which also, given all of this money that we've already proven that you have, given the four mechanisms I've given, we think that you have the ability to protect yourself against things like attacks by hiring private security, by broadcasting when attacks have happened on your agency, by getting in international sanctions and things like this. Maybe not sanctions, but forms of support from international institutions when you're being targeted. For all these reasons, very proud to propose. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for that speech. We now invite the leader of the opposition to open the case for the opposition bench.
On second thought, I would rather not be recorded because what I'm going to say is a bit tricky.
We can all tell stories, but the fact is we do these debates on structural reasons and the incentives of the actors involved. At that point, I don't think the introduction of the LO speech matters unless they can prove that this is the vast majority of cases or the most important incentive of an independent news media company, which I would posit is not the incentives of an individual person. A couple of direct responses. Firstly, they say that even because these are not autocratic regimes, there are opposition-led opposition media companies which are funded to similar extents because of rich people. Firstly, why is this true in every single hybrid regime? I'm actually not sure. I would posit given hybrid regimes are characterized by the fact that they are consistently undercutting democratic values and undercutting democratic opposition, they are getting weaker with time, and the ability of independent free media gets weaker over time in these places. Secondly, it's likely that they still have less power than the state-owned company, right? Even if you're ignoring like the media protections given to those state-owned companies, I'd posit there is still independent funding that comes from the state and prioritization of ad space or coverage of state-owned media when that's covering what the state wants to be given out. Or simply, like private media statements, the direct statements given to the state-owned media and preferable treatment in terms of news from the government. I would just posit they are still more powerful in terms of reach than the independent, like other opposition parties anyway. But thirdly, there's every reason to think then that we are one of those not state-owned, opposition-led media companies on LO. If they're correct that the vast majority of non-state-owned media companies are set up by people who are against the state, that is probably why we were set up. At the point where this is an independent news media company that is not state-run, in a hybrid regime where it's quite difficult to not be state-run, it's very likely that when you took on the high startup cost and the high risk of engaging that company, you were one of the people who was against the state in doing it. Secondly, they say you are guaranteed to be targeted by violence and this sort of thing. I just do think likelihood analysis is something we should do in debates, especially the top room of round 4 of Euros. But hey, I'm just one person. I would say that's not the most pressing incentive of an independent news media company for 4 reasons. One, because media companies are, no thank you, made up of people, but an independent news media company is not a person. So it's unclear why the individual incentives of survival would be the primary incentive of a news media company. When we add up individuals' incentives to represent what a company's incentive is, it is only where there's a shared goal in terms of why they are part of that group or why they are part of that company. So it is fine for us to say the individuals in an independent news media company likely are against the state because they've chosen to work there as opposed to for the state-owned news companies, and they have a shared vision of spreading non-state propaganda. But it is not fine to say they all have individual incentives of survival, and therefore we should add all those up and ignore the news media company that they have chosen to work together in independent incentives and instead go for all of that. That is not sufficient. Secondly, obviously the company already took on an immense risk in terms of setting up, and clearly the government is going to call any criticism fake news anyway, so I'm not sure why this is really comparative from opposition bench. I think it's fairly clear that when you took on the amount of risk in terms of setting up a company like this and the expense of doing so, you did so choosing not to be a state-owned company. I think there are implications from that. Thirdly, obviously the independent journalists who work for this company chose this over the alternatives, as Andy tells you repeatedly. It's the fact you chose to work there instead of for state-owned companies. You chose to work there instead of moving to a country where it's not a hybrid regime and you can actually pursue free and fair journalism. The individuals who chose to work for that company or set up that company made decisions, and that was to stay in a hybrid regime and stay defending an independent news company. That has implications for what they care about and the fact that they do not care about the state and state propaganda, but also they do not necessarily prioritize themselves because they would have had a much better life in a democratic regime with free and fair protections. But finally, you promised to be independent. Setting up an independent news media company is telling the world that you are independent in what you present. And I therefore think it's very important that you uphold the implications of that you make sure you do all of the things you cannot actually do on opposition bench in terms of being impartial, that you prioritize criticizing the state, which looks like funding the kind of investigative journalism into state practices which is necessary when the state is massively hiding their corruption and corrupt practices, like prioritizing, making sure you call out the bad practices that will never be called out by state-owned media anyway, and making sure it is the priority of what you do, knowing you've limited scope and the ability to reach people, but knowing it is the most important thing you can offer to make sure that the general news media scheme offers a balanced perspective. At that point, I think when people have relied on your promise of being independent, but also that is what you were set up for and that's what people care about, is what you all prioritize the most. No thank you. But in terms of this claim, right, that you will either get shut down or murdered in general from the opposition bench, I would note a couple of things. Firstly, hybrid regimes generally want to appear democratic to some degree to external actors, even if they are not, or to the people within that country, even if they are not. What that means then is that they generally pay lip service to the democratic values, even though they don't themselves engage in them. They often hold elections, even if those elections are not free and fair. And they often accuse the opposition of not engaging in democratic practices, even if they themselves are not either. And the implication of this is, even if the state doesn't necessarily want there to be an anti-state media company, the bar is pretty high to shut down that company or kill the people involved if there's a massive risk that you would get called out for doing so. At which point there is quite a high bar for opposition bench to say you would massively shut down those companies from being anti the state. Instead, I think there are some ways you might make life difficult for them, but it's unclear you would end their existence because it's quite difficult to do so while still maintaining this facade that you're democratic generally. Secondly, I would note, often because of the fact there is Western and external backing and funding as a result of this, the first thing to note is usually general expertise of the kind of investors who choose to invest in anti-state media in various hybrid regimes. There's a level of expertise to make sure you have an airtight case against the legality in that country, that you have the right kind of lawyers who can argue the case to make sure that you don't get arrested or shut down arbitrarily, to make sure that you can have your media company continue to exist into the future. No, thank you. I think it is far more important that that gives you access to those resources. But secondly, because those are actors hybrid regimes do not overtly want to piss off too much, because the rich investors from the US or from any other Western country generally do not like it when their investments are randomly shut down and are likely to lobby their governments because of the anger they feel when the money they have spent is massively wasted. And therefore, even if it isn't likely that the US would take massive action against hybrid regimes as a result of this, the sheer perception that there is a risk associated with it means that the hybrid regimes are likely to just not try and face its consequences generally and avoid them as it stands by not shutting down companies arbitrarily for the vast majority of the time. But before I engage in the even if of that case, Hadar.
Yeah, all of your nice values mean nothing if people don't believe them. You might as well preach to the walls.
So I suppose I don't think the individuals in an independent news media company necessarily care about being believed by like state propagandists if they care about choosing to be an independent news media company. But even if you do get shut down, right, on their side, you just are not sufficiently differentiated from state-owned media, which gets far more funding and direct information as previously flagged. And the opposition response here is flagged twice in POIs to Andy is, but you're going to be impartial, so you can still criticize the government and you'll be different. Firstly, obviously the state-owned media also calls itself impartial. Obviously they also say we are impartial and we are covering both sides, even though they're not. And I'm not sure why the average voter or person in that country has the ability to differentiate between the two, or is going to like line by line go through articles and see what's different between the impartial, small, independent news media company and the state-owned media company. So it's quite hard to differentiate even if you are promising impartiality. But secondly, I think there is a difference in terms of the funding and priority you actually give to what you investigate. I think if you don't do investigative journalism, you don't actually uncover the corrupt practices if it's not your priority to do so, which is there's just many kinds of actions that will never actually get coverage on their side, which is incredibly important. But thirdly, I think you just betray your values on opposition, because if you think about who sets up these companies or chooses to join them, they are betraying the reason as to why they've done so and not gone to safer pastures instead. I think they need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you don't have to sacrifice your journalistic integrity for a meaningless sacrifice, and failure to do so will fail them to win this debate. Propose.
Speaker for the speech, we now invite the deputy leader of the opposition to close the top half debate.
One extraneous bit of rebuttal, the rest I'll flag in my speech, and that is the idea that you only get foreign capital if you are actively and aggressively anti-government. Note that this is simply not true. If you manage to portray yourself as an independent news outlet, you are significantly more likely to receive foreign funding, foreign capital. Why is this the case? First, and most primarily, because any sort of foreign funder is interested in seeing to try to uphold objectivity and democratic discourse themselves. They do not want to be seen supporting just another semi-autocratic opposition party within the state. They want to be seen trying to support overall journalistic quality, leading to better quality of governance in that country as a whole. No analysis on why it would only be like aggressively anti-status quo, but presumably also aligned with the opposition in that given country, funders on their side of the house. Let's talk about journalistic preference and why it actually matters. So you chose to become a journalist. What does that mean? That means you have some sort of incentive to uncover the truth, you have an incentive to dive deep, find nuance, details of stories, like you actually presumably want to be a journalist in the sense of actually being a journalist, and you probably have some sort of honor and dignity in your job. That means you don't want to be instrumentalized by your employer, for instance, to simply make up shit that you throw at the party that you know is wrong and incorrect. Second point, you chose to join an independent news company. What does that mean? That means that you had alternatives at the point at which you chose your job. Those alternatives would be joining an anti-government NGO. There you can tell lies to try to go against the government. It would be to join like an explicitly partisan opposition-sponsored media company. Note that even in extreme cases where an opposition-sponsored media company would be outlawed in the country that we're talking about, these journalists as individuals could likely emigrate and join, for example, a Soros-sponsored anti-Orban media company based in Vienna and not based in Hungary. These options exist, especially in the EU, so these foreign things would also exist. That means that if the employees of these companies had the incentives that opening government wants you to believe they have, then they would most likely have sought a more direct and more imminent path to act upon these incentives and not joined an independent news company, which by definition hangs between the sides in this sort of context and is not partisan aligned, either pro or anti-government in that given system. Now, responding to DPM, why this actually matters? Well, it matters because, especially in a journalistic enterprise, the employees actually have an incredibly large sway over the direction of the company as a whole. Why is this the case? Several reasons. Firstly, in the case like for fast publishing, direct online publishing, often reporters are self-editing. Like you produce something, there's minimal oversight, it goes directly out. That means presumably what you are aligned with is what you will be putting out and thus will be representing the slant of the company. Secondly, if you are a journalist in this company for longer, you will become an editor. If it's an old-fashioned outfit that still edits its publications or broadcasts, etc., then you as an editor will have followed the same incentive structures when joining the company and will also therefore be aligned with this. Thirdly, the board of directors, the board of management, the representation of the employees within the company is also made up, fact check, of people who are members of the company, therefore also likely finding the same alignments. And fifthly, and most importantly, if the company goes against these deeply held convictions and beliefs of their employees, they will lose a large number of their employees, thus making it a lot more difficult for them to do their job. Government posits to you that the alternative would be now to find like anti-government radicals to fill the role, fundamentally changing the identity of your news outlet from an independent news outlet to an anti-government shitfest. And that, in turn, goes against the branding of your own company, because presumably if you are a media company and if you are responsible as the CEO of this media company for the branding and recognition of that company, you also have an incentive to be perceived as non-partisan and being balanced and being an actual media company and not just a specific output. Yes?
I assume that people care about journalistic integrity when this is a debate about prioritization of issues and presentation of facts. At that point, it matters that someone tells the people about government malpractice, which requires someone to prioritize it. That can be you.
I'm sorry, that is simply not true. So being a non-partisan or like independent news agency does not mean that you cover up government misdeeds. You simply cannot claim on side government that it is that we are defending like being a pro-government news outlet. That's like reread the motion, come on. Now let's talk about the reach of the media company, building on what Uzair does. So the media outlets in these sort of hybrid regimes are almost all further the party political interests of a given actor. So you have the state media, which they concede, which furthers the state idea, and then you have some form of opposition media or privately sponsored entities, which further the opposite. And then you have people, counter to what DPM says, who are not idiots, who don't find it incredibly hard to differentiate the truth from the lies. They see their lived reality, and then they read or see on TV or see on YouTube what is reported about that lived reality, and they see the dissonance, meaning that they become increasingly fed up with this obviously fake news that they're being portrayed. Also note that in countries like Hungary or Turkey, a majority of people actually like the person who is in power, like Orban or the Turkish guy. So they won't be swayed by this radically anti-establishment, anti-government thing that they propose. This leads to exhaustion, meaning that the only way to actually differentiate themselves from the mass, and this is exactly what the Prime Minister wants to do, is not to just be another one of the highly partisan lying outfits, but to be the only one that tries to be as impartial as possible and tell the truth, meaning that we then achieve the goals that Prime Minister wants to achieve of having being able to inform a greater number of people, having more profit due to more circulation, because we appear as the only one that's actually not lying. And finally, the idea of degree of state oppression and why it's importantly non-binary. Well, so how easily can the state shut you down? Note that even in these somewhat dysfunctional states, the political capital of a dictator or a semi-autocrat is not endless, meaning that if you paint a big, huge target on your back by constantly reporting obviously biased or untrue things, they can use the functioning legal court systems in their countries to have you as a media outfit banned or outlawed. Contrast this to where, still in a semi-functional country, they try to outlaw or ban a media outfit that does not paint a target on its back. The political cost is higher. It's much more difficult to get this through. It's much more difficult to justify to the voters who at the end of the day still vote. So it's just much more likely that our very existence will be furthered on side opposition, not side government, and therefore very proud to oppose. Yeah, whatever.
We thank you for the speech. We now invite a member of government to open the case for closing arguments.
The first extension from closing government is why impartiality is impossible and always insufficient, and why being impartial necessarily means that you are supporting the regime. I want to strategically place this extension before I go on to proving it. I think that if we prove this, this takes out opening opposition's case on good reporting. That is, people feel like they're betraying their principles and doing fake news. They have an incredibly assertive image of what impartiality looks like that is not sufficient to win this debate. I think also if we prove this beats opening government, because I think there's a big hole in their case is proving why impartiality is actually insufficient. Because they say we'll prioritize our storytelling a little bit more. We'll actually bite the bullet and say why actively being biased in all instances is a necessary thing. Why is being actively biased necessary and why is impartiality insufficient? Because the middle ground, being reasonable, rational, displaying the objective facts and being impartial is not possible because all of those things have been co-opted by the incumbent regime. The very language that you use of rationality, the way in which facts are presented and how people internalize those facts, the way in which audiences actually look at the fact that you've presented to them and then interpret what they actually mean, the significance that has for their lives, has been poisoned irreparably by the regime. I want to paint a picture for you. When you as an independent news company want to do impartial coverage of how the state treats religious minorities, that impartiality and the presentation of objective facts has already been clouded by the regime's rhetoric itself. Because when you say, hey, the regime does X, Y, Z, the public looks at those impartial facts and says, hey, well, actually, that's a good thing. Because that's what seems reasonable to them because of all of the years of state-owned media. And so it's never sufficient for you to be objective in that way. And criticizing the regime, giving facts that go against the regime's narratives is never seen as impartial. It is always seen as reactionary. It is always something that is seen as extreme and unreasonable. And that is because the state-owned media has a dominance over the media landscape, because they've been incumbent in many instances for a very large amount of years, because they have privileged market share and advertising and reach, because people don't want to seem sus to other people and be the only one in their friend group or their family or their community that reads this radical left-wing newspaper that people think is garbage. Because what the regime has done is forcibly dragged the Overton window to their side and poisoned the very language of rationality and reason that media organizations need. This proves why you need to be actively biased, because opening government is correct. You care about journalistic integrity. You care about holding truth to power. These are precisely the kinds of people that have self-selected into being journalists and laying their lives down for the truth, but you need to be actively biased. Opening government needs this to be comparative. This also weighs out against all of the stuff that opening government tells you about. You get slightly more funding, because you don't matter if you get more funding if all of the journalists feel terrible about themselves, if they don't think that anything they're doing has any real purpose, because they think that they're actually betraying their principles. This takes out top half. Second extension from closing government is characterization of hybrid regimes and why hybrid regimes actually want you to exist as a media company that is biased against them. Opening government relies on this, relies on you basically having any sway at all, because all of the stuff about funding and stuff only really matters if the regime is actually going to tolerate you and actively have you around and eating up its own market share. And this, by the way, this also takes up opening opposition stuff about they're going to shoot you in the street or whatever. 3 reasons why hybrid regimes actually want you around as an independent media source that is actively biased against them. Firstly, they need it for political legitimacy. And I know opening governments say this because DPM says you want to appear as democratic so people don't backlash against you, but I have no idea what this actually means, how this manifests, or why this materially harms the regime. Like why they're so scared of this loss of political legitimacy, right? Because I don't think that if this is sufficient to tip over an election or something like that. The reason why is because you need international political legitimacy. For example, in order for Hungary to stay within the EU, they need to meet a certain amount of minimum standards of democracy. Because if they keep killing more journalists and keep stamping out everything, they're literally just not going to be in violation of their treaty obligations and going to be kicked out. Or Turkey, which actively either wants to join the EU and is currently in the process of joining the EU, or secondly, just wants more political legitimacy because it wants to be seen as a stable, reasonable actor within that region, so it has more geopolitical dominance and it gets more funding from, for example, the United States. Secondly, I think that cracking down on independent journalism chills FDI, because now when foreign firms see this, and crucially these are countries like Bangladesh, like Turkey, that need an influx of foreign capital to diversify their economies, when companies see this, they get spooked, because they say, what if they crack down on me? What if in my corporate practices, I criticize the government or some of my employees get fired? These are precisely the reasons why they no longer want to operate in these countries. But thirdly, because the state uses these outlets selfishly to leak stories that is convenient to them. So, for example, when they want to leak a story that helps that is good for them in some way, what they want to do is to pump it in the state-owned media, but also get media that is opposed to them to leak it to some extent as well, because now people think that this is watertight. This absolutely needs to be true because there is some sort of consensus on it, which is why selfishly it is oftentimes useful for these regimes to have these media around, versus the minimal harm of having a few free outlets around. I think that all of these benefits outweigh that. Opening government needs this to work, and I think this actually proves why the backlash is significant enough for these people, for these regimes to want to keep these media outlets around, and it takes out the rest of opening opposition. Before I go on, Joji.
So, given your characterization of media landscapes, why would anyone actually read the more biased media on your side of the house?
Yeah, because obviously, I think there is firstly, I'm going to prove why we're not actually contingent on lots of people within your domestic country actually reading the newspaper outlet, and why international backlash is far, far more significant. But secondly, I think for all of the reasons that opening government gives, which is people don't want to look like idiots, oftentimes people aren't totally brainwashed, obviously anyway. Third argument, why you're actually able to get change and why you're able to force the regime into making concessions. This is incredibly important in the debate because all impacts that opening government give you on you get slightly more information out to the public and you get slightly more publicity or money or whatever. Doesn't matter if you're just shouting into the void and none of the stuff you're doing actually has any impact. So how crucially do you extract concessions from the ruling government? Because I think internal change is just very difficult, right? Oftentimes people are pretty baked into their views. Oftentimes people there is just state dominance, and they say this influences voting patterns. I'm not really sure what the extent of that is, whether that is significant enough. The crucial mechanism is international pressure. Things like breaking stories and doing investigative journalism that spooks people from the outside. And note our framing earlier. This looks like things like the EU kicking you out or chilling investment, like when Erdogan, literally company, I paint the picture of this, right? Bangladeshi and Turkish media companies literally have leaked, done investigative journalism into government corruption, and basically that has led to capital flight, right? Companies have pulled out because they don't want to live in a country that doesn't respect property rights. Or things like NGO pressure, exerting pressure on you and saying, we will not do humanitarian aid in your country if you keep abusing human rights in this way, because they don't want to align ourselves with a government that is going to taint our image. All opening government says is that the US wants to give you slightly more funding to destabilize your country. These are reasons as to why you are actually able to get the other countries to support you. This is unique to other external actors coming and doing this because you have pre-existing connections and sources. You speak the local language. You have privileged geographic access where oftentimes international companies are barred from going into certain areas. This is a massive impact in the debate. Closing government.
We thank the speaker for that speech. We now invite the member of the opposition to open the closing opposition case.
I am going to start my speech in... Oh, I can't. There's no... I'm going to be able to read that. Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We're going to win by breaking the symmetry on where we will actually be comparatively believed more, explaining why people can tell when you aren't biased, why they believe you more when you aren't biased, and then the impacts of this where you actually achieve change, what the actor actually cares about, which is getting his message out there and people believing him. And obviously this is also logically prior, because if nobody believes you and nobody consumes your media, then none of the impacts that anybody wants to talk about are actually achieved. Before that, one point of rebuttal. Well, I guess 3 parts of rebuttal to the case we hear from closing government. 1, they're uncomparative. If people don't believe us, then nobody is going to watch this media, and obviously these things exist on a spectrum. There's a degree to which people don't believe things. How do I know this? Like, the more left-wing media is less believed by Republicans than media that is more in the middle, right? It still exists on a spectrum where people will believe some things that people say, given that they are less biased than when they are more biased. Cool. Secondly, why is it that... secondly, just people aren't that brainwashed. Like, come on. And there are going to be 2 structural reasons and then 2 examples. 1, there's external knowledge, so people actually know that what the government tells them isn't true because they have access to the internet in a relatively free manner in these countries and things like that. And B, they have a lived experience where life is shit. And so they know that the government isn't telling them the truth and that things aren't as good as the government is trying to say. 2 examples, Bangladeshi protests where hundreds of thousands of people are going out into the street in order to protest against the government. Turkey, where the Turkish elections had massive elections. Or even Iran, where the guy who the Khamenei didn't support got voted in. So I think that yes, but these people definitely to an extent understand that they don't like their existing government. Cool. Why do we think that we're going to be comparatively believed more on our side? We're going to do this comparatively at every step of the way. 1, I think that on their side of the house, the state constantly attacks you and shows how you are biased. And they have the ability to do this. They can point out the way that you are misrepresenting the policies that they did and how this is bad. Now, why is this comparative? Because on our side of this house, there's a good chance that the government will actually use the positive pieces that we write. If we write, the government did Orban did a good job on the economy in this way, Orban has an incentive to say, look, this person says that we did a good job. As soon as he does that, it makes it more difficult for him to then come and say, these guys, you shouldn't believe anything they say. Everything they say is a lie, which means that it is more difficult for them to discredit us. 2, people just aren't that stupid, right? Your tone does shine through. The kinds of stories you write, what you decide to cover, how you describe the leader and the government are all ways in which I can tell whether what I'm reading is pro the government or against the government, is biased, and to what extent. So, for example, if you read The Guardian or CNN or Breitbart, then you don't have to be a genius to understand where they fall on the political spectrum, because it's clear by the stories that they choose to cover and how they choose to cover them to what extent they're biased. But on our side of the house, we have far more nuanced coverage. We cover both the successes and the failures. We give credit where credit is due, but at the same time also say here are the bad things that the government actually did, which means that you can actually also see how it is less biased. But secondly, it's by the journalists you actually hire, right? If on our side of the house, all of your journalists are left-wing journalists who all come from this specific university and all have the same tone of voice, then it's much easier to point out that you're biased. If on our side of the house, the journalists come from a variety of backgrounds and have a variety of beliefs and probably express themselves on other platforms in a variety of manners with different beliefs, then it's much easier for me to believe that they aren't biased. Secondly, there are far less international partnerships on their side of the house. Why? 1, because international bodies care a lot about trust, right? If the CNN, BBC, etc. make their money on telling people the truth, and if they quote people who are actively biased, who aren't telling the truth, then when people discover that they've been lied to, or when their readers understand that this isn't accurate, people won't read their content as much, which means they have an interest in cooperating specifically with people who are trustworthy, who are impartial. Secondly, they also care about this because it's part of their ethics. They say, we care about the truth. We care about journalistic integrity. That's why we try to hold ourselves to these standards and our partners to these standards. On the comparative, which means they're much less likely to take part. Why is this important? Because if we have a lot more work with BBC, our articles are published in CNN and on these places, then oftentimes these are just generally respected news sources, which means we can get their credit. If they trust us, then people in our country are more likely to trust us as well. Notice this is also often a variety of sources. It's going to be Al Jazeera and BBC and other kinds of sources, which means it's difficult for the government to paint them as specifically against you, because it's not just like, oh, only the American Western media. No, it's media from all around the world that has all sorts of coverage. Fourthly, I think that often just your ability and willingness to critique the opposition is important, right? Oftentimes, these kind of, like, these countries are not completely autocratic. They still have elections. It's just that the opposition sucks balls. And if you lie and say, oh no, the opposition are actually great, then people are like, no, they're fucking awful. That's why we're not willing to vote for them. And that means that you actually lose a lot of the trust and a lot of the belief in you. If on the comparative, you're willing to show you aren't just an opposition puppet, you have far more belief and trust in the things that you're trying to say. Not right now, I'll take you in a second. Now, why do we think that this is very important? We think that on comparative, they won't believe us even when we tell the truth. Two reasons for this. One, trust is psychologically binary. Think about Republicans and Fox News, right? They trust Fox News blindly, and they won't trust media that they view as biased. They won't trust at all on anything. They think that vaccines are a lie because they come from the Western media, even though it has nothing the fuck to do with the fact that maybe they don't cover Donald Trump in an unbiased manner. Secondly, I also think it causes an emotional reading. If I am reading these things and I feel like they are biased, then it causes me, when I read them, to feel like they're going to betray me, like I can't trust them, and it causes me to be angry. And so I associate the things they say in a very negative manner, and so I don't want to accept them no matter what they're talking about. Before I continue, I'll take PY from opening.
So other pro-government sources will also claim to be impartial, also be pointed to by the state. Uniquely, you'll be called fake news when you criticize them on either side.
Yeah, I think I analyzed this in a very comparative manner. This is not going to be sufficient to take us down. Cool. Why do we think this actually wins the debate? One, I think it causes, when people trust you and they trust you to the truth, it does three things. One, it causes far more mobilization and demand for change, right? When you tell them that something bad is happening, they actually believe you and they are far more willing to be mobilized. They trust that this person has actually been sent to jail when they shouldn't have been sent to jail. They trust that this person is corrupt and has been actively harming them, even when they wouldn't trust the opposition that was just trying to do a hit piece. Secondly, they also understand the depth. They are willing to read through your entire article that explains how this is a significant backslide and will actually harm their daily life, rather than just writing it off as fear-mongering by the opposition. This looks like more people being willing to turn out to protest when Turkey tries to take away power from the Supreme Court. It looks like more people in Bangladesh being willing to turn out to the streets to protest against what the government is doing right there. Secondly, there's far more chance of international exposure and effect through pressure. When we publish our articles, the international community is far more likely to pick them up. Why is this crucial? Because speed is critical. The pressure on Bangladesh to open up its internet to actually see the horrors that are going on there means they find it far more difficult to put down riots to a very extreme extent, and so the international support is crucial. Please propose.
We thank the speaker for the speech. We now invite the government to conclude the government message.
Is this being streamed or recorded as well? Both, excellent, alright. So, let me embarrass myself on international television here. Yeah, so I am naturally told, as has been the case for the last few years. I have thereby obtained a laptop stand, so I can read my notes. I try to own it as much as I can so it doesn't look awkward, but it probably doesn't work.
Unnatural pause, a fun phrase.
Maybe. Thanks for the order, guys, yeah? Yeah, right, sorry about that. All right. Starting as soon as my timer is up. All right, ready? Yeah. I first want to explain what the extension does with regard to top half, and then I will spend the majority of my speech clashing with CO, given that I think they actually give a comparative in this debate, which I think is crucial for there to be a call here. I want to note two separate groups of observations on top half. A, on the incentives of the act that they discuss, two things here. Firstly, all the stuff about prior decisions or the company decided to join is just quibbling about what the status quo is. Like, the motion doesn't provide if before the motion is implemented you're impartial or biased already. I just don't think it's the case you can derive something from that. Secondly, though, even if you have people who disagree with the shift, they presumably will just leave the company at the point at which you shift in this way. Therefore, I'm just not sure what the harm or the actual incentive of the journalist is, or why it actually matters when you make this decision. Therefore, I think the important clash here isn't just just what you want to do, but rather the thing we all agree on, which is that journalists care about the truth. The question then is, what is the truth within this debate? And we are the team who gives you the analysis as to why it is that what counts as the truth when you live in a country like Hungary, a country like Turkey, is to need to be biased against the state, which is what Aidan proves to you. Let me then briefly place this against our opening. The main argument is this idea that you're able to get like more people to read your stories and you get more change when you do this sort of criticism that like is necessary. I want to make two observations here. Firstly, I think opposition are right to point out that OG need to account for why it is that you uniquely need to be biased to get this, as opposed to being impartial. That is, Aidan's extension is the one that shows you why impartiality is inherently pro-government bias. Therefore, I think for them to access their mechanisms, they need their extension. Secondly, though, even beyond this, we take a lower burden in that we don't need to prove to you that you convince people in your own country, but rather we mechanize how you're able to persuade people abroad on our side. I want to then just discuss the question of impartiality and what we bring to you in extension. Three things here. Firstly, the social effect and how impartiality shifts within those countries. And this is the most important part of the extension. That is, I think what counts as impartial in places like Hungary, in places like Turkey, depends on what the mainstream conversations are. This is true for a few reasons. Firstly, what counts as impartial depends on what everybody else is saying. That is, if it's the case that as COPOIs, everyone's already criticizing the government, it's not seen as particularly partisan for you to do so. Secondly, though, in many of those countries, governments are incentivized to withhold the relevant information from the public. That is, what would be impartial for you to take out and report on happens to be withheld at the point at which most firms are unlikely to report to it or they don't have access to that information. Thirdly, though, exactly because of the media capture of the governments within those countries, most of the other outlets are going to be opposed to what you're saying. What this means then is that you don't just get cracked down on just when you're being biased or just when you're being critical, but when you don't take a staunch pro-government line, this already gives reasons for other firms to call you out or for the government to essentially dissociate themselves from you. The reason the CEO response doesn't work here is because they say, well, sometimes you may write positive stories about them and they may like you for that reason. Look, this is either symmetric for the reasons it then gives you, or if it isn't, the issue becomes that the government will prefer associating with their own media firms, given that local people already believe those firms I'm going to explain in a moment. Therefore then, I just think it's the case that you need this information and you need the separate voice for there to be a comparative or change in this debate. Secondly, though, I want to prove why the government does have this hold within social conversation. Top half seems to accept this, CO come up and dispute this. What I want to note here, framing-wise, is that for these regimes to rise, especially hybrid ones, they need predominant social support. They often come out of electoral regimes, and importantly, this means that you're dealing with countries where you have many disappointed or disillusioned voters. The implication of this is simple. These are not people who are going to trust the external information or international sources that closing opposition wants, but rather they're ones who are very often likely to be supporting the regime in the first place. This is where Yishai's last piece of analysis works against CO. That is, they prove to me why it is that when you have a prior bias against a media firm, you're less likely to want to engage with it in the first place. What this means then is that when these independent firms are often the ones who are being criticized during the election, the one who you're calling out as Western misinformation, especially because when people like Orban are campaigning, you need to be able to essentially be populist and push yourself away from those who would criticize you. It's the case that you're unlikely to suddenly believe those actors when they're suddenly being pro-government or when they criticize. Therefore, I just don't think it's true that you get much of the change that they want on their side. Thirdly, though, we prove to you the unique international effects of the extension, and this is where we clash with CO. Basically, what CO here says is that, people, you're still able to essentially, push out stories, but that somehow they claim that you're not going to be believed on our side. I have a few responses here, and I think the main issue is that this relies on the unnuanced understanding of how bias reporting should be understood. Firstly, what counts as impartial and as regular reporting in countries like Germany or France or the UK will be biased for the reasons I proved to you. Secondly, though, being biased doesn't entail lying about facts. It's the case that the opposition bench concede that journalists want to say the truth. Therefore, I think bias doesn't look like making shit up, but rather taking a critical perspective and prioritizing those critical stories against the government. Thirdly, though, even if it's the case that you are being seen as biased, the information that you generate can be pushed by more legitimate media like the CNN, like the BBC. They can take their raw data, they can take your sources, and they will want to collaborate with you on those reasons. Next up, COs say that you have access to external information. Firstly, they never prove to you why you accept this information, and I think we do a good job of characterizing why you're unlikely to do this. Secondly, though, I just think that it's the case that for many of those individuals, they probably won't have like the highest degree of access, be it because of things about like whether there's like a language barrier with many of the international sources, be it whether they're likely to want to go and seek them out for themselves, or whether they're going to be criticized when they do so by the people around them. You're just unlikely to see much of this change. This is where Aidan proves to you how it is that you do pressure these regimes. This is when it's the case that you can do things like withdraw EU funding from them and pressure them from outside. Opening.
So we prove that given the population in these countries, we reach the most people, and this is most directly aligned with the company preference. Your impacts are much more distal and less aligned with corporate preference.
I don't think you have a preference to reach people if, as Zoho concede, you care about the truth. If you have to lie to them, if you have to moderate things for the sake of appealing to the regime, I don't actually think you have an incentive to do this. The final thing I want to respond to and basically emphasize is your case on why it is the government is going to crack down on you on our side of the house. Three things here. Firstly, they just don't see you as particularly dangerous because they explain to you why it is that you're going to be likely marginal within the country itself. They probably want to rely on you for the stuff Aidan discusses. Secondly, it's a tokenistic but yet an incredibly important concession for access to much of things like grants or indices, basically. Crucially, it looks really good outside of the country, even if it doesn't cost them very much internally for the reasons we give. You can knock on the desk, but OG don't prove to you why the cost isn't high. You need our case for that. Thirdly, though, I just think it's the case that they often use you to leak stories against the opposition, for example. Therefore, this means that you have a productive relationship. You're never going to be very important within your own country, but being impartial is nothing but a concession to lying. Only on our side do you expose some of the worst excesses of the government, and for these reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
Then as we prepare the speech, we now invite the opposition whip to conclude this debate as a whole.
May I? 3, 2, 1. Ishai already won this debate. I'm going to spend majority of this speech explaining why and showing to you why the most important question in this debate is why you have more credibility. Before that, I want to do a bunch of extenus rebuttal to the CG extension and then perhaps some rebuilding on the attempted rebuttals at ours. Firstly, I want to discuss their extension. There wasn't actually much of it because for some reason Aidan spent most of his speech rebutting OO. Good for you. I think, however, the main chunk of their extension is basically saying, look, impartiality is impossible because the public is so brainwashed that you can never get through them with just being impartial. I want to observe the two crucial issues with this extension that were never proven. One, they actually assert that the public is so brainwashed. And I know they use nice intuitions for this because, oh, hybrid regimes with a lot of authoritarianism, of course they have a lot of brainwashing. Sure, I agree. I concede that they have some degree of national media. I concede that they have propaganda. There's a leap between this and proving the public is stupid. Few reasons that Ishai already gave, and I'll give more, for why we think that the public farmers' protests in India when they were displeased with the defunding that the BJP gave to poor states. This is why we see massive protests of people literally risking their lives when right now over 100 people died in protests in Bangladesh protesting against the government because they are so critical of the government that they are willing to do that. We really think this does not stand a reality check of how people think of the government. The actual reason why people still vote for authoritarian governments in these countries is not because they are brainwashed and stupid. It is most often because they really just don't have a better alternative, right? Hungary has communists and Nazis in its opposition. The alternative to the BJP is the INC, which literally did a short-term dictatorship in the 70s under the excuse of emergency rule and has terrible history with casteism. We think that there are actual reasons people vote for them, not because they're fucking stupid. Second issue with the CG extension, we think that they show a problem at best. They never show a solution. They show why, when you are being impartial, it's not enough for people to believe you because they're so brainwashed. Panel, if people are so brainwashed, if you're going to be biased against the government, they'll believe you even less. Why does our extension win? Several reasons on why credibility is the most important metric in this debate. One, we just think it is the most unique non-symmetric benefit in this debate. Note how many things in this debate don't actually change much. On both sides, you criticize the government, meaning that on both sides, you have risk, like OO says, of the government persecuting you or censoring you. On both sides, you have degrees of showing the public, like OG wants, that the government is doing bad things. Like when they do properly shit things, you would still criticize them. This is not being biased. This is saying the truth. So we think our benefit is the most unique because it shows why specifically when you are being impartial, you are more likely to be believed. Secondly, we think that also as an actor, you clearly care about this. We have a lazy response from OG to our POI saying that they think, oh, but you probably care about saying the truth independent of what people think about this. This is not how journals operate. Consider all of their working structure and their education. They learn actively things like media and publicity skills in order to make their article more accessible. They have editors that their whole job and the salary is justified by making them more accessible and believable to the public. They use touching pictures and stories that are not crucial for the truth or the facts because this appeals to people more. They are using attractive clickbaity headlines to make people read them. We think they genuinely care. Lastly, it is really logically prior to everything in this debate. Why is it logically prior to everything in this debate? We think that it is obviously logically prior to your ability to balance out biases, because if people don't believe your criticism of the government, then you're not balancing the bias against the government. It is logically prior to ethics, because if people don't believe the truth you're speaking, you're not getting the truth across. It is logically prior also to international actors funding you and helping you, because if international actors see that you are useless, that you're not changing anyone's mind, you're not helping them topple the regime, so there's no reason to waste resources on you. And yes, it is even logically prior to things like censorship and persecution that OO wants to prove, because note, as they are attacked by OG, they don't show why on their side you won't be persecuted, which sounds like it's something that could be happen anyway if you criticize the government. But crucially, if you're popular, if the people believe you, this is precisely when you'll get massive backlash if you persecute these journalists. This is when people will go out and protest if they see that you are trying to silence the truth. But if no one believes them, this is when it's easy to persecute you. Opening.
Your case on spotting bias or balance only activates when people engage with your views. Given the pro-government sources are bigger and better publishing pro-government
Thank you.
Only OG get people to engage with you.
Yeah. I think people engage with us when they believe us. I think also we show you get more funding from international sources on our side. Cool, let's continue. Lastly, I want to rebuild on this weird accusation that we get that, oh, people will not see us as impartial on either side of the debate. Few answers that I think are already in Ishai's speech. One, people genuinely care about the truth. And this is important. People are criticizing the government when it does terrible things. However, when you're saying something that is opposing what they view as ideologically impartial, they care about this. We hear from Chris, oh, but you don't have to lie. Sure, you don't have to say lies, but when you are showing only one perspective, it is actually offensive to people. Consider if an Israeli reporter was to report the incident of saving 4 hostages from Gaza by saying the government kills 200 Palestinians again without mentioning the context of saving the hostages that Israelis care so dearly about. Imagine if in Hungary, the journals were to consistently oppose and criticize also policies that are massively popular and the public supports, like the government ban on migration, because the Hungarian public is genuinely nationalist and cares about protecting their jobs. We think that even if it is technically the truth and not lies, people are offended when you lie about this. We think that other than this, when people see you collaborate with international bodies, when people see that the government is willing to sometimes share your news, this is when people do see that you're credible on our side. Oppose.